The sign came down on a Friday morning in April. I was standing on the sidewalk in front of a 22,000 square foot industrial facility on West 16th Street in Indianapolis, watching two men on a lift remove the letters from above the entrance, one at a time: Cortland, Industrial Salvage, and Auction. The C came down first, then the O, then the R. Theo was beside me eating a granola bar, watching the letters come down with the calm of a child who has been told exactly how something happened and has processed it completely and is now simply watching the conclusion arrive. He was 11 years old. 3 months earlier, he had been standing in a different parking lot watching a different kind of delivery. And he had heard something said about his father that I will tell you about in a moment. The T came down, then the L. I want to tell you how we got here, because the distance between that January morning and this April morning is not the kind of distance you measure in time. It is the kind you measure in what you know and what you are willing to do with what you know. 3 months earlier, Diane Cortland had pulled up to my shop on a flatbed truck with 15 engines that she had purchased at an IRS auction for $4,200. She had an audience, 3 people she had called specifically to be present, including a journalist from an Indianapolis automotive trade publication. She had a performance prepared. She delivered it in front of my employees, in front of my son, in front of anyone within earshot, with the cheerful generosity of someone doing a favor they have arranged for maximum visibility. She said she was giving me something to work with since my shop had been quiet lately. She said she hated to see good talent go to waste for lack of material. She said it the way people say things when the saying is not really about the thing being said. The journalist wrote it down. Theo was 11 years old, and he had his mother's ability to read a room, and he heard every word, and he looked at me with the expression that I had spent 11 years learning to answer correctly. One of those 15 engines, sitting in the back corner of Diane's flatbed under an oil-stained canvas tarp, was a 1965 Ford 427 SOHC racing engine from Ford's factory drag racing program. The last documented surviving example from a confirmed factory race at the 1965 NHRA Nationals in Indianapolis. The engine that Ford's own factory records had listed as unaccounted for since December of that year. Diane had paid $280 for it. I sold it for $12 million. And then I bought her factory. The A came down from the sign. Then the N. Theo finished his granola bar and put the wrapper in his jacket pocket and looked up at the remaining letters. "Almost," he said. I said, "Almost." I grew up in Speedway, Indiana, which is a town that exists inside Indianapolis specifically because of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. 1 square mile of residential streets and small businesses built around the most famous racing facility in the world. You do not grow up near motorsport and speedway. You grow up inside it. The sound of the speedway is the background of your childhood. The smell of racing fuel is what summer smells like. Engines are not machines in speedway. They are the language the town speaks, and if you are paying attention from an early enough age, you learn to speak it before you learn much else. My father, Gerald Webb, worked as a machinist at a small engine rebuilding shop on Crawfordsville Road for 28 years. Not glamorous work, not well-compensated work in any way that the outside world would have recognized as such. But my father approached it with a precision and a pride that I absorbed completely without being explicitly taught it, the way children absorb the things that matter most, through proximity and repetition and the daily evidence of what a person considers worth doing carefully. He said one thing about engines that I have thought about every working day since. He said it once, not as a lesson, just as a statement, the way you state something you consider obvious, that an engine built correctly was a moral act, that you were making a commitment to the person who would depend on it, that you did not cut corners on a moral act. He meant it completely. You could tell by everything he touched. I never went to college. After high school in 1996, I went directly into engine work, first at my father's shop as a general laborer, then as a machinist's apprentice, then as a builder in my own right. By 21, I had a reputation in the Indianapolis engine community as someone with an unusual capacity to take a damaged or seized engine and understand not just what was wrong, but why, and to rebuild it to a specification that exceeded what it had been before. I spent 9 years at Meridian Engine Works, a performance engine shop in Indianapolis that built engines for IndyCar teams and where the owner, a man named Phil Caruso, ran a shop where the standard was absolute and the tolerance for mediocrity was precisely zero. Those 9 years were the education that everything since has been built on. I opened Webb Engine Works in 2008 at 30 years old in a leased space on Crawfordsville Road in Speedway, 1 mile from the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Location in the engine business is a statement. I wanted mine to be clear. I met Nina Okafor in 2010 at an engine builders conference in Chicago. She was there representing an aftermarket parts supplier, and she asked me a technical question during a panel discussion that was more precise than any question any of the other attendees asked, which told me immediately what kind of person she was. We married in 2012. Theo was born in 2013. Nina died in February 2017 from a pulmonary embolism. A Wednesday morning, Theo was 4 years old, no warning. I closed the shop for 10 days. Then I opened it again because the shop was what I had, and Theo needed stability, and I needed the specific sanity that comes from work that requires your complete attention. Theo grew up at the shop the way I grew up at my father's shop. Not as a visitor, not as someone being supervised, but as a presence, a participant. By 11 years old, he could read a bore measurement and understood the relationship between compression ratio and power output. He had his mother's directness and my patience and an opinion about everything delivered without hesitation and usually without error. He called the shop our place. He had called it that since he was old enough to talk. When I worked late, he sometimes fell asleep on the old couch in the corner of the office, and I would carry him to the truck when I was done. He never complained about falling asleep there. I think he preferred it. Diane Cortland had built Cortland Industrial Salvage and Auction over 19 years into one of the largest salvage and auction operations in central Indiana. Government surplus, estate liquidations, IRS seizures, business closures, Cortland Industrial handled the movement of assets that institutions and individuals needed to convert to cash quickly and without sentiment. She was not a gearhead. She was a businesswoman who operated in a world adjacent to automotive. She knew the market value of engines and vehicles. She did not know what they were. This distinction between knowing the price of something and understanding what it is was the distinction that defined everything that followed between us. In late 2023, Diane's company purchased a lot of 15 engines at an IRS asset forfeiture auction in Indianapolis. The engines had been part of the estate of a man named Vernon Chalk, a 78-year-old collector and former drag racer from Indianapolis who had died in 2022 with outstanding tax liabilities that triggered an IRS estate review and eventual seizure of his assets. The 15 engines had been stored in a climate-controlled unit on Vernon's property. The IRS assessor had cataloged them as miscellaneous automotive engines, various makes and conditions, estimated scrap value $200 to $350 each. Diane's buyer looked at the online listing, saw 15 greasy engines in varying states of disassembly, and bid accordingly. Total purchase price, $4,200. Approximately $280 per engine. She had no storage capacity for them at her main facility, a floor space issue that had been ongoing for several months. She needed them moved. The decision to move them to my shop was not entirely a practical one. Diane and I had a history, not dramatic, but specific. 2 years earlier, I had declined a contract from Cortland Industrial to rebuild engines from their salvage inventory at a rate that Diane had proposed and that I had assessed as below the cost of doing the work correctly. I had said so directly. She had expected negotiation. She received a flat no. She had not forgotten it. The delivery was framed publicly as a business opportunity. Surplus inventory she was passing along to a local shop. She called 3 people in the Indianapolis automotive community before the delivery: a parts supplier, a competing shop owner, a journalist from an Indianapolis automotive trade publication. All 3 were present on the morning of January 9, 2024, when the flatbed truck pulled into my parking lot on Crawfordsville Road. I was at my workbench when I heard the truck. I came out front. Theo was already there. Schools were closed for a teacher development day, and he had been in the shop since 8 a.m. working on a model engine kit at the back bench, which was how he spent school-free days when he chose to come in, which was most of them. Diane stepped down from the passenger side of the truck with the particular energy of someone who has arrived somewhere with a prepared performance. Her assistant was with her. Her 3 guests were standing to the side. She looked at me with the warm and entirely constructed smile of someone delivering a gift. She said, loud enough for the journalist, loud enough for my 2 employees who had come out to see what the truck was, loud enough for Theo, who was standing in the shop doorway with his model engine kit in his hands, that she was bringing me something to work with. That her shop had more inventory than she could move, and she hated to see good material go to a landfill when there was talented local craftsmanship that could use it. She said it with the specific precision of someone who has chosen every word for how it lands rather than for what it means. The journalist was writing. My employee Carl, who had been with me for 9 years, looked at the engines being unloaded and looked at me and very carefully did not say anything. Theo was in the doorway. I looked at him. He was looking at Diane with his mother's expression, the one that assessed and categorized and filed. Then he looked at me. I said, "Get your notebook." He went and got his notebook. Diane's truck finished unloading and left. The 15 engines were in my parking lot. The journalist drove away. Diane's guests drove away. Diane drove away. My parking lot contained 15 engines and a January morning in Indiana. I walked over and looked at them. 12 were what they appeared to be: damaged, seized, or partially disassembled units in varying states of distress. 2 were more interesting than their appearance suggested. The 15th was in the back corner wrapped in an oil-stained canvas tarp that had been on it for what appeared to be a very long time. I stood in front of that tarp for a moment. Then I went inside and told Carl to help me move the engines into the shop. I spent the first 3 days doing systematic assessment. Every engine photographed, every engine measured, identification attempted where possible. I kept notes in the same format I have used for 18 years. Engine number, condition assessment, identification status, preliminary value estimate, recommended course of action. Lori Stanton, my business manager, 44 years old, who had been running the administrative side of Webb Engine Works for 7 years, created a formal log from my notes so we had a clean record of everything that came in. 12 engines assessed and categorized by the end of day 2, 2 requiring closer examination on day 3. The 15th engine I left for last. Not because I had forgotten it, because I had been thinking about it since the moment I saw the tarp. On the afternoon of day 3, a Thursday, I moved the 15th engine into the main shop on a rolling stand and pulled the tarp back. I looked at it for a long time. Theo came over from the back bench and looked at it beside me. He said, "What is it?" I said, "I'm not sure yet." He said, "But you think you know." I said, "Get your notebook." He already had it. What I was looking at, and I want to be precise here, because the precision is what made it real and what will make it real for you, was a V8 engine with a specific cylinder head configuration that I had seen in photographs many times and in person exactly once, in a museum display in Dearborn, Michigan, when I was 19 years old on a trip with Phil Caruso, who had taken 3 of his apprentices to see what he called the most important engine Ford ever built that nobody ever got to race. Single overhead camshafts, 1 per cylinder bank, the specific valve cover geometry, the specific port arrangement, the machining characteristics that were unlike anything else Ford had ever produced before or since. The kind of design that a company attempts once when it is trying to win at any cost, and that gets banned before it proves what it can do. The Ford 427 SOHC, the Cammer. I called Hank Pruitt that evening. Hank was 62 years old and had spent 30 years as an engineer in Ford's engine development division in Dearborn before retiring in 2018. He lived in Mooresville, Indiana, 40 minutes from Speedway. We had known each other for 16 years. He had come into Webb Engine Works in 2008 in the first month I was open, had watched me rebuild a damaged 427FE for an hour without saying anything, and had then introduced himself and said he thought I was the best natural engine builder he had encountered in his career. He had been a resource and a mentor and a friend since. When I called him that evening, I described what I was looking at. I gave him the casting numbers, the valve cover configuration, the specific machining characteristics I could identify. I was careful. I did not tell him what I thought it was before he had heard the evidence because I wanted his assessment to be clean. He was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Then he said, "I'll be there in the morning." He arrived at 7 a.m. with a leather document case and the focused quiet of a man who has spent the night deciding whether to believe something and has arrived at a position. He looked at the engine for 45 minutes without speaking. He brought his own measuring instruments. He examined the casting marks with a flashlight held at a raking angle. He looked at the valve train geometry. He examined the oiling system modifications with the attention of someone who knows specifically what he is looking for and why. Then he opened his document case. He had brought photocopies of Ford factory records from his personal archive, documents he had accumulated over 30 years in Ford's engine division, including production records for the 427 SOHC program from 1964 and 1965. He spread them on my workbench and cross-referenced what he was seeing with what the records described. Theo was at the back bench. He had not been told to stay. He had simply not left. At 11:30 a.m., Hank sat down on the stool at my workbench. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Marcus, do you know anything about Vernon Chalk?" I said I didn't know the name. Hank said, "Vernon Chalk ran a Ford factory-supported drag car at the 1965 NHRA Nationals, right here in Indianapolis. His car ran a 427 SOHC. He made the final round. A fuel line failed during the burnout before the final. The engine cut out, the car retired, and the engine was pulled and returned to Chalk's shop. Still sealed, never opened, exactly as Ford had assembled it in 1964. I waited. The engine was never returned to Ford. Factory records show it as unaccounted for after the 1965 season. He paused. He looked at the engine. The casting number on this block matches the production record for the engine assigned to the Chalk program. The shop was completely quiet. Theo put his pencil down. I looked at the engine, then at Hank, then at the engine. I said, "How certain are you?" Hank said, "Certain enough to call Klaus Mayer." Klaus Mayer was 71 years old and had been the foremost independent authority on Ford factory racing engines for 35 years. He had authenticated 11.427 SOHC engines in his career. He had rejected 4 claimed examples as fraudulent. His authentication was the standard the collector car and engine market accepted without question or qualification. I asked Hank directly, after he had confirmed his own assessment, if he knew which collector had been searching for this specific engine the longest. He thought for a moment. Then he gave me one name, Thomas Aldrich. Hank called Klaus that afternoon from my office. He was on the phone for 22 minutes. I sat at my workbench and looked at the engine and thought about a canvas tarp and a January morning and $280. Klaus Mayer flew from Dearborn, Michigan to Indianapolis on a Thursday morning in late January. He arrived at Webb Engine Works at 9 a.m. with a document case that was larger than Hank's and the particular deliberateness of a man who has been doing something for 35 years and understands that in his field there is no acceptable substitute for thoroughness. He spent 2 full days with the engine. I worked around him. I answered his questions when he had them, which was not often. He preferred to work with the primary evidence rather than with explanations. Theo was in the shop both days. He did his homework at the back bench and watched Klaus work with the patient attention of a child who has learned that some things are worth watching carefully. On the second day, a Friday evening in late January, the shop quiet after Carl and my other employee had gone home, the 4 of us alone in the space, Klaus sat at my workbench and opened his document case. He found the page he had been going to since the first hour of the first day. He read from it without editorial comment in the precise voice of someone making an official statement. Ford, factory racing engine, 427 SOHC configuration, assigned to Vernon Chalk Racing, NHRA competition use, 1965 season. He read the engine serial number. Last documented location, Chalky Racing Facility, Indianapolis, Indiana, December 1965. Status, unaccounted. He looked up. The serial number stamped on this block matches. The casting characteristics are consistent with the Dearborn factory tooling used for the SOHC program in 1964 and 1965. The valve train geometry is correct to factory specification. The oiling system modifications are consistent with the racing configuration Ford used for the 1965 drag program. He paused. This engine has never been disassembled. The original factory assembly marks are present on the main bearing caps. They are intact and unambiguous. This engine left the Ford factory in 1964 and has never been opened. I have authenticated 11 of these engines in my career. I have never seen one with this level of documentation completeness and this level of physical integrity. He looked at me directly. This is the most significant Ford factory racing engine I have examined in 35 years of this work. The shop was quiet in the specific way of a space where something important has just been said and the people present understand its weight. Theo put his pencil down and looked at the engine across the shop, sitting on the stand where it had been since I unwrapped it, looking exactly as it had looked when Diane Cortland's flatbed had left it in my parking lot along with 14 others. He looked at me. I looked at him. He said, "What's it worth?" I looked at Klaus. Klaus said a number. Theo picked up his pencil and went back to his homework without another word. The expression on his face was the expression of a child filing information into a category that he has decided requires no immediate response. The restoration took 6 weeks. Hank and I worked on it together. Every component inspected and documented before it was touched, every decision recorded, every original part that could be preserved. Hank provided the factory specification knowledge from 30 years of personal records from Ford's Engine Development Division, information that existed in no published document anywhere, that lived in his notes and his memory, and that he transferred to my documentation with the systematic care of someone who understands that the knowledge will need to outlast both of them. The work was the most careful work I had done in 18 years of building engines. Lori Stanton built the provenance file in parallel. IRS auction records, estate seizure documentation, Diane Cortland's purchase records, the bill of sale from Cortland Industrial to Webb Engine Works, Klaus's authentication report, 112 pages, Hank's technical documentation. The Ford factory records cross-referenced against the physical evidence. Every link in the chain from the Ford factory in Dearborn in 1964 to my shop in Speedway in 2024, documented, sourced, and verified. The provenance file was 847 pages. Theo asked to read Klaus's authentication report one evening when I had left it on the kitchen table. I said yes. He read all 112 pages. It took him 3 evenings. When he finished, he put it back on the table exactly where he had found it and said, "He's very careful." I said, that was why his opinion mattered. Theo said, "Like you." I did not say anything. I put the report back in its folder. I did not call an auction house. Thomas Aldrich was 67 years old and had spent 40 years assembling what was considered the most significant private collection of American factory racing history in existence. Cars, engines, documentation, artifacts from the golden era of American motorsport. He lived in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, 40 minutes from the Ford factory where this engine had been born 60 years before. He had been looking for the chalk racing engine for 11 years. It was the one documented for 27SOHC from a confirmed factory racing program whose post-race location had never been established. I called him on a Tuesday morning in early March. I told him what I had. I told him the serial number. I told him Klaus's conclusion. I told him the provenance file was 847 pages. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. Then Thomas Aldrich said, "I'll be there Saturday." He arrived at Webb Engine Works on Saturday morning with his own authentication specialist, a man named Robert Fenn, who had worked with Thomas for 20 years, and whose specific function was to prevent Thomas from making an expensive mistake. Robert Fenn was methodical, skeptical by professional orientation, and entirely without sentiment about his work. He spent 4 hours with the engine and the provenance file. Then he sat down with Thomas in my office, a small room off the main shop floor with a desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet, and a photograph of my father Gerald at the Crawfordsville Road Shop circa 1989, standing in front of a rebuilt 396 big block with his hands on his hips and the expression of a man who has just confirmed that what he built is correct. Robert Fenn looked at Thomas Aldrich and said 4 words. "It's everything he said." Thomas looked at the photograph of my father on the wall for a moment. I do not know what he was thinking. Then he looked at me. He said, "Name your number." I'd talked with Hank and Lori about this for 2 weeks. I'd thought about it alone at night after Theo was asleep for longer than that. I had thought about my father and what he said about building correctly being a moral act, and about what a fair number looked like when you were standing on one side of a transaction that you had arrived at through paying attention for 18 years, and the other side had arrived at through not paying attention at all. I said $12 million. Thomas Aldrich did not counter. He looked at me and said, "When can I have it?" The wire transfer cleared on April 3rd, 2024. I was at my workbench when Lori came in from the office and put her phone face up on the bench in front of me with the bank notification on the screen. I looked at it. I looked at her. She had the expression of a person who has been managing the administrative side of an extraordinary situation for 3 months with complete professionalism and is now permitting herself one moment of something other than professionalism. She said, "What do you want to do now?" I said, "Is Cortland Industrial still on the market?" She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "I'll have the offer ready by Friday." Lori Stanton had known about Diane Cortland's financial situation since February. A contact at a commercial real estate firm in Indianapolis had mentioned it in passing. The Cortland facility had been quietly listed since November 2023. A commercial loan called early, a government contract not renewed, 2 large auction commissions that had fallen through in the second half of 2023. The appearance of stability had been carefully maintained. The stability itself had not been there for 14 months. Lori had told me in February. I had said nothing about it for 6 weeks. I had been thinking about it for 6 weeks, but I had wanted the engine transaction to be complete and clean before anything else happened, because I did not want the 2 things connected in any way that could be questioned. The offer was submitted April 5, 2024. Full purchase, facility, equipment, business name, existing contracts. The number was fair, not generous, not aggressive. I had been specific about that with Lori. I wanted to pay what it was worth. Not more, not less. Diane's attorney called Lori on April 8th. He had 2 questions. The first was whether the offer was firm. Lori said yes. The second question was whether the buyer was Marcus Webb. There was a silence on the line. Lori said yes. The attorney said he would call back. He called back 4 hours later and said his client had accepted. I did not call Diane directly. I did not need to. The transaction said what it said without any additional language from me. The closing was April 19th, 2024, a Friday morning. I brought Theo, who took the morning off school, with my full support. Lori was there. Hank was there. The closing attorney was there. Diane had sent her attorney. I had expected this. I said nothing about it. The documents were signed. The keys were handed over. I walked through the facility with Theo after the attorneys left. 22,000 square feet, loading docks, storage bays, office wing. I walked it the way I walk any unfamiliar space, methodically, paying attention, noting what was there and what it could become. Theo walked beside me with his notebook. In the main storage bay, the largest space, high ceiling, concrete floor, the kind of room that could hold a significant operation. Theo stopped and looked around. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What's this going to be?" I looked at the space. I thought about the shop on Crawfordsville Road. 16 years of work in that space. Good work, work I was proud of. I thought about what my father had said about building correctly being a moral act. I thought about a canvas tarp and 15 engines and a January morning and a journalist with a notebook. I said, "Engine works. Bigger one." Theo wrote something in his notebook. He showed me what he wrote. West 16th Street. Webb Engine Works. He closed the notebook and looked up at the ceiling of the storage bay. The high industrial ceiling, the clear-story windows, the afternoon light coming through them at the angle that April light comes through north-facing windows in Indiana. He said, "Grandpa would have liked this building." I looked at the ceiling. I thought about Gerald Webb at the Crawfordsville Road Shop for 28 years. about what it meant to do the same work in a bigger space, to apply the same standard to more material, to make the same moral commitment on a larger scale. I said, yes, he would have. 2 weeks later. A Saturday morning in early May 2024. The sign above the entrance had been changed. It now read, Webb Engine Works, West 16th Street. The Crawfordsville Road Shop was still operating. I had promoted my lead technician Carl to manage it while I established the new facility, and he was running it with the same standard I had set in 2008, which was the only standard I knew how to set. Theo was in the new shop with his notebook, making a list of things the storage bay needed before it could function as a proper engine build space. He had organized this list into categories: equipment, infrastructure, utilities, workflow, and he was going through each category with the systematic attention he brought to everything worth doing carefully. He was 11 years old. Hank was at the new workbench with coffee. He came on Saturday mornings now, had started coming during the restoration, and had continued without either of us making a formal arrangement about it, the way useful habits establish themselves. On the wall of the new office, the room that used to be Diane Cortland's office, 3 things were pinned to the corkboard above the desk. The first was the IRS auction lot sheet from the Chalk Estate seizure. 15 engines, various makes and conditions. Total purchase price, $4,200. Purchaser, Cortland Industrial Salvage and Auction. The second was the wire transfer confirmation from April 3, 2024, $12 million, received by Webb Engine Works. The third was a photograph that Theo had taken on his phone on the morning the sign came down. Me standing on the sidewalk in front of the building, hands in my jacket pockets, looking up at the old letters being removed. Theo is not in the photograph. He took it. At the bottom of the photograph, on a strip of masking tape that Theo had applied sometime between the morning it was taken and the morning I found it on the corkboard, in his handwriting, Webb Engine Works. April 2024. I had not put it there. I had come into the office one morning, and it was already up, arranged with the other 2 documents in the order that made the most sense: the auction sheet, the wire transfer, the photograph. The beginning, the middle, and the end of a story told in 3 pieces of paper. I stood in front of the corkboard for a long time. Then I went out to the shop floor where Theo was completing his infrastructure list and Hank was finishing his coffee, and I picked up the tool I needed and started work on the new space. Outside, the May light was doing what it does in Indiana in spring. Broad and unhurried, the kind of light that comes after a long winter and carries with it the specific quality of a season that has earned its arrival. The shop smelled like any new space smells when the people who are going to work in it have just begun. Like the possibility and the faint industrial residue of everything that happened there before. Some things look like scrap until the right person looks at them. Some things sit under a canvas tarp for 59 years waiting for someone who knows what they are. Some people hand you something with the intention of diminishing you and hand you instead the thing that changes everything. The engine knew what it was from the moment it left the Ford factory in 1964. It had been waiting for someone to confirm it. I had been waiting for the same thing, in my own way, for 18 years. We had found each other on a January morning in a parking lot in Speedway, Indiana, for $280. That was enough. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Is there something in your life that someone handed you as an insult? Something they considered worthless beneath their attention, not worth a second look? Because sometimes the thing they hand you to diminish you is the exact thing you needed. What did you do with it? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. If this story reached you today, share it with one person who needs to hear it. You already know who that is, and if you're new here, subscribe. Every week, a story like this one, real people, real decisions, the kind that stay with you